Hello everyone. Good afternoon from Oxford. Thank you so much for joining us for the 11th session of our Engaging with Evidence webinar series. I say good afternoon. I know we've got lots of people joining us from across the world today, so good morning, good evening, depending where you're calling in from. I think what we love about this webinar the most is it's bringing together everyone from across sectors, but also across continents. So do say hello in the chat, introduce yourself and let us know where you're dialing in from today. My name is Bonsaver. I am Policy and Engagement Associate here at the Government Outcomes Lab based at the University of Oxford, and I'm absolutely delighted to be co-hosting this session today with my colleague, Tanyah Hameed. Today's session is an exciting one because we're drawing on hot off the press research just published yesterday by ID Insight, which has just released the final results of the Village Enterprise Development Impact Bond. Launched back in 2017, this program aimed to raise income levels for households living in extreme poverty in Uganda and Kenya, making it the first ever development impact bond for poverty alleviation in sub-Saharan Africa. According to this new evaluation, it has had an enormous impact on the lives of many, exceeding its original targets. I am sure our speakers today, many of whom were closely involved in the development and the evaluation of the programme, are very much looking forward to discussing the impact in much more detail with us today, along with the challenges as well that you faced during the programme delivery. So to briefly introduce ourselves, we are a policy and research centre here at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. We were created 5 years ago as a partnership between the UK government and the university. We investigate how governments partner with the private and social sectors to improve social outcomes and look at innovative financing tools such as social impact bonds. Alongside our research, a really important part of our work is also to ensure that the insights that we and others around the world are producing are made accessible and can be used in policy and in practice. For this reason, we have a number of engagement and capacity building activities, including this Engaging with Evidence webinar series. Launched last year, these sessions are grounded in research, but more importantly, we want to facilitate an open discussion and look at practical considerations for those working on the ground. It is a platform for policymakers, for practitioners, for academics to all come together and engage in the latest findings in the field. Some of our sessions are in partnership with other organisations, including today's session, which is in partnership with the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. For our next session, we will be having a session on the 6th of April, where we'll be sharing findings from a recent review by Social Finance and the Government Outcomes Lab, which seeks to develop comprehensive frameworks for assessing the readiness of ecosystems and service provider organisations to engage in outcomes-based partnerships. While we're discussing future events, just a reminder that we do have our call for papers. The deadline is the 4th of April for our Social Outcomes Conference, which is taking place this September. So this conference is our annual convening of researchers, practitioners and policymakers working to improve social outcomes. Because our ambition is to create a vibrant exchange between sectors, we are looking not only for academic papers, but also practice-focused presentations for those working in the field. For any of these future events, if you want to kind of keep up to date with anything coming up, I'd encourage you to sign up to our monthly newsletter, which I'm sure one of my colleagues will drop in the chat shortly. So coming back to today, we are going to follow a similar structure to previous sessions, starting with a short presentation and followed by a panel discussion. Firstly, we'll be hearing from Rinche Kananu and Christy Lasiki, both co-authors of the ID Insight report, who will discuss the results and learnings from the Village Enterprise DIB. For the second part of the session, my colleague Tanyah will moderate a discussion with our wonderful panel of speakers. We'll be thinking about the rationales behind using outcomes-based funding in poverty alleviation, how the programme adapted to COVID-19, and the use of randomised control trials for measurement and evaluation. We like to keep these sessions interactive, so do say hello in the chat if you have any questions and your reflections throughout this session. If you'd also like to raise your hand on Zoom as well, if you want to ask a question at any point, we will come to you and we'll be stopping the session at various points to ask audience questions. So do please feel free to get involved. People also quite enjoy the networking element that comes with the chat as well. So, do connect with others. We will be recording this session. So just a reminder that we will be uploading it also to our website afterwards. It's always really nice to see people's faces during our webinar sessions. Of course, if you're not comfortable, don't worry, but we do love it when the cameras are on so we can see everyone getting involved in the discussion. And just a reminder to stay muted when others are speaking. Great. I think I've got through all of the housekeeping reminders out the way for this session. I know we've got a great discussion coming up, so I will hand over to our first presenters, Winfred and Christy, who, if you'd like to first introduce yourselves, that would be fantastic. So over to you. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Laura. So I will go first. So hello, everyone. We are very excited to be presenting the results of the Development Impact Bond today. So my name is Winfred Kananu. I am an associate at ID Insight, and I will be co-presenting the results with my colleague Christy, who's also on this call. But also on the call, we have other teammates, that is Frida, who will be participating in the panel discussion, as well as Emily. Christy, would you like to introduce yourself before we start the presentation?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Christy Lizicki. I am an economist with Causal Design and was an economist supporting this project with ID Insight when it launched many years ago. I'm looking forward to sharing the results with you today.
Thank you. So yes, we can go to the next slide. So today, basically, we are going to go to briefly recap how the evaluation was designed in order to measure the impact of the program. Then we will discuss the main results, which I am sure a lot of you are excited to learn about. And then we will conclude with a few discussion points before moving to the panel discussion. Next slide, please. Okay, the next one. So in terms of program implementation, the program was implemented in 241 villages in Western Kenya and Eastern Uganda regions from 2017 to 2020. And this involved nearly 15,000 households. So these villages and households were carefully selected by Village Enterprise through a participatory wealth ranking exercise that identified the poorest households. So within each of the villages, 60 poorest households were randomly selected and offered the program. So the vast majority of households that were approached to participate in the program actually agreed to do so, and about 97.5% of them received at least a first cash grant to invest in their businesses. The majority of this group completed the business training and mentoring, and they also eventually received the second and the final cash grant. So as at ID Insight, our team independently verified that those grants were actually disbursed through several checks, which included financial audits of village enterprises, bank statements, and also some mobile transfer statements. We also did surveys with recipients, and also in some cases there were physical witnessing of grants being disbursed. Next slide. So on the study, the main objective of our evaluation was to measure the causal impact of Village Enterprises program on the economic welfare of ultra-poor households in Western Kenya and Uganda. To estimate that impact on household consumption and assets, we designed a randomized control trial. So the Village Enterprise program, the Village Enterprise group had already conducted the wealth ranking exercise in all study villages. That included 241 control villages, meaning that we were able to draw from an equivalent pool of ultra-poor households in both control and treatment villages for the study. So for purposes of this evaluation, we randomly selected 21 of those households in each of the 482 villages, and we successfully collected data from about 98% of our sample. The RCT design made it possible to continue with the evaluation even after the COVID pandemic upended the global health and economic environments, since it would have affected the treatment and the control groups in the very same way. So we were still able to isolate the exact impact that the program had on household outcomes by comparing these two groups. So the important caveat here that we'd like to highlight is that our results reflect the causal impact of the Village Enterprise program during the pandemic, which is actually a very useful and relevant information because it likely speaks to the possible effects of this type of program in other types of economic shocks. So for the timeline, which is our next slide, the chart you see shows the data collection timeline overlaid onto the program timeline. So those 241 treatment villages were divided into 7 cohorts, and the program was rolled out to each cohort, and it lasted for a period of 1 year. We had initially planned to do 2 end lines, the first one in early 2020 after implementation was done in the first 4 cohorts, and then the second one in 2021 after the last 3 cohorts, so that we would be able to capture outcomes a year or less after the program ended. Unfortunately, due to the COVID pandemic, we had to cancel one of one of the end lines, and we only managed to do one end line and collected data for all cohorts in 2021. So while this means that our results are a bit different than we had planned, since now the data was collected 2.5 years after the first cohort finished the program and only 6 months after the last cohort finished, we think that this design is still very interesting, since we are able to see how the effects of the program might have varied over time by comparing the different cohorts. So Christy will be sharing a bit more about what we saw under the results. Next slide, please. So on data collection, we conducted the exercise from May to August 2021, where our enumerators collected data from about 10,000 households across all the 482 study villages. This was a huge effort. As you all know, the COVID pandemic introduced a lot of challenges, and it was also IDInsight's first return to in-person data collection since the pandemic hit in 2020. We wrote a couple of blog posts on our website summarizing our lessons and experiences on collecting large-scale data safely in the COVID period. And we definitely encourage you to check those out in our website in case you're involved in research projects where you need to collect primary data, or if you're just curious to learn how we went about it. We will now move to the results, and I will hand over to my colleague, Christy, who will walk us through the results and the discussion points. Christy?
Thanks, Winnie. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll be taking us through some of our key results here. And the first result I wanted to share is that we see that the Village Enterprise Program had a significant and lasting impact on household consumption. So households in the treatment group consumed about $10 more per month than households in the control group, which equates to about an increase of 6.3%. Effects were larger in Kenya than in Uganda, about 4 times in absolute terms, though households in Uganda or in the Uganda region in the study were poor. So if we consider in percentage terms, the impact was about twice as large in Kenya. We can also dive into the consumption index to see what particular goods people are spending more of in the treatment group. And we see that in both countries, consumption effects are driven mainly by increases more in food consumption versus non-food consumption, especially by staple foods and meats. So how do we think about all of this? First of all, it's very impressive that we're seeing any difference in consumption between the two groups. As Winnie just mentioned, we're talking about 2.5 years after the program had ended for some of these households, and of course the pandemic ongoing in the second half of our study period. Second, this is not the first RCT that Village Enterprise had conducted. The first was conducted only in Uganda by Richard Settlemyer and IPA a few years ago, where they tested several different variants of the program. However, the standard program generated consumption effects that were essentially equivalent to what we found in Uganda. So again, this is a story of maintaining effects in spite of a pandemic. And then finally, of course, there has been plenty of other research in the graduation space. Graduation models have been evaluated in many other contexts. One of the more famous studies reported on the effects of graduation programs from 6 RCTs conducted in 6 different countries. And they found an average program effect equal to about 5% of consumption in the control group. So again, what we're seeing here is similar or larger effects than graduation programs run outside of the context of a pandemic. Next slide, please. Turning to the impact on assets. So we also see a positive impact of the program here in both countries, indicating that households have not spent down the full value of the cash grants that they received for their businesses. On average, this increase is about $40, and that's equivalent to about 52% of the value of the average cash grant given to households. Again, here we're seeing larger effects in Kenya, and this is at least in part because some business groups in Kenya received cash grants that were 3 times larger than the typical Village Enterprise grant size. And in a moment, we'll see that these households that received larger grants had substantially more left over at the time of data collection than households that received smaller grants. And again, we can dig into the index and see what in particular or how households are using those cash grants. And we see that they're not just sitting around as savings or as cash, but rather households are investing these in durable assets and livestock, as well as additional inventory for their businesses. As Winnie mentioned, I can go back. Was there one more slide before? Yes, thank you. As I just mentioned, Village Enterprise experimented with the size of the cash grant that they gave to business groups. And some business groups received $150 in total, or $50 per household. And another group of households received cash grants that were 3 times as large, so $450 in total, or $150 per household. And so what's interesting here is that we see similar effect sizes on consumption for the 2 groups. And so it seems that the cash grant doesn't appear to increase the month-to-month effectiveness of the program. However, we do see larger effect sizes for assets among those households that received the larger grant, likely because while both groups are spending down the value of the grants, the group that got the larger grant has more left at this point. And we can move to the next slide. So as Winnie mentioned earlier, the rollout of the program happened in a staggered fashion across 7 cohorts, which gives us the opportunity to look at the impact by cohort. So that's what we're showing here in this slide, where we're looking at the treatment effect by cohort, where cohort 1 refers to the cohort that received the program first and completed in 2018. And cohort 7 refers to the program that completed last, or the cohort that completed last in 2020. And so one interesting finding here is that we don't see consistently larger effects for either outcome for more recent cohorts, which suggests that the magnitude of treatment effects don't seem to change that much over time. As you may notice here, though, we also see that for cohort 4, treatment effects are smaller and also not statistically different from 0. We don't know exactly what happened here, but one hypothesis is that these programs, or rather these households, finished the program right before COVID, and so potentially their businesses didn't have the opportunity to become fully established. And also Village Enterprise provided additional mentoring to cohorts 5 to 7, so this cohort was right on the cusp of not receiving that. Yeah, sorry guys. We also compared how treatment effects looked for households that had different levels of wealth at baseline. And so here we do see a positive association between baseline wealth and consumption effects, especially in Uganda. And this is not unlike what other poverty graduation studies have found, where even among the ultra poor, households that are poorest sometimes cannot engage in the same entrepreneurial activities as slightly better off households. On the other hand, we don't see a clear relationship between baseline wealth and treatment effects on assets. Next slide, please. And then finally, we asked respondents whether and how they were economically affected by COVID. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the majority, although not all respondents, reported that their economic welfare was negatively impacted by the pandemic. However, what's interesting is if we look at the treatment effects comparing these 2 groups, those that had been reported had been negatively impacted and those that had not, we don't see any differences in program effects. And so we thought that was pretty interesting, since it suggests to us that the program is similarly effective for households hit hardest by the pandemic, giving some hope that these types of graduation approaches may provide households with some resilience when they're hit by large shocks. And then one more slide. So I'm going to just close with summarizing some of those key points. So again, we found that the Village Enterprise program had a positive effect on household consumption and assets, with effects persisting for several years after the program had run. Effect sizes are similar magnitude to what past studies have found in graduation style programs, including the previous RTT of the Village Enterprise program. And despite the pandemic happening in the second half of the study period. And also we find some interesting variation in impacts across countries, cohorts, and other characteristics, which provides useful information on what types of households may benefit the most from these sorts of interventions in the future. Yes, sorry, next slide. And we're particularly impressed that the program was able to sustain impact through COVID. However, it is worth noting that the pandemic may have impacted the effect sizes of the program and the generalizability of the findings to a non-pandemic context. We'll be exploring this impact, heterogeneity, resilience, and the pandemic as a moderating factor of treatment effects in a journal article that our team is currently working on. Next slide. And finally, I wanted to close with some lessons for our teams being part of the Development Impact Bond. And we'll discuss this a bit more in detail in the panel, but wanted to preview a few thoughts here. So the first is that the evaluation is really the linchpin of the Development Impact Bond. If the goal is to pay for measuring impact, then getting the impact evaluation right is essential. Otherwise, we're moving back towards traditional ways of doing things, such as paying for inputs. Second, it's important to focus on outcomes that lead to improvements downstream for the implementing organization, in this case, Village Enterprise. This can give them the flexibility to innovate or to improve. In this case, we see Village Enterprise really strengthen their monitoring systems. And then the final lesson is, if working in a vulnerable environment, it's really important to design the evaluation to be able to measure impact in the case of shocks. If we hadn't had a control group, we would have not been able to isolate the impact of the program in the face of COVID. And this also could have been the case with a different economic, environmental, or other shocks to the communities. So this brings us to the close of the key findings that we wanted to discuss. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share these results and learnings with you all.
Thanks so much for that, Winfried and Christy. Thank you for taking us through the evaluation process and guiding us through such insightful findings on the impact of the DIB. And yeah, such wonderful news that it's done so well as well. So really encouraging for the sector. We've got a few minutes before we move on to our panel discussion. So with anyone who's got any questions that they'd like to give, be it in the chat or feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you. This would be a great time. I think I can see one person. We've got Rashid. Could we go? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you for the wonderful presentation. I was just curious to understand, was there any particular type of businesses which were able to do better in the context where we evaluated this? So were there any specific business features? So, communities who did better and, that came out clearly in the evaluation. It would be good to understand. The other thing is about the impact of COVID on the evaluation, the internal validity of the evaluation itself. If we think in linear terms that having additional source of income has a linear effect on your outcomes. So somebody who does not have the cash grant, are they impacted more by the absence of the cash grant than the treatment group? So does that somehow put a threat to the internal validity of the evaluation? I'm not sure if my question came out very clearly, but yeah, still.
Yeah, I might actually ask you to clarify the second question again, but let me talk about the first question. So we had data on business type for the businesses in the treatment group, the businesses that were part of the Village Enterprise Program. We did not have data on business type for the comparison, or rather the control villages, because we weren't tracking them as part of the program monitoring. So what we can look at with that data is look at how consumption and assets vary across, or look at how the outcomes vary across different types of businesses. Granted, this doesn't give us the full story because we don't have that comparison we don't have the control to compare to. But what we did see when we looked at how consumption varies across different types of businesses is that average consumption was similar, and average net assets was also similar across. We saw that crop businesses consumed a little less, and households with businesses that kind of had multiple categories consumed more. And also we saw that the households of the livestock business had slightly higher assets. So we don't have a super clear story for that, but just to give you some insights of what we observed, at least with what's going on with the businesses in the treatment group. And then coming back to your second question, yeah, I wasn't exactly sure. Were you asking whether the finding about baseline wealth being correlated with outcomes, was that something about the cash grants?
Yeah, so what I was thinking is, having some additional income, does that affect your outcomes linearly? So in that case, it would be same for the outcomes for control and treatment. They would factor out evenly. But if it's something like an S-shaped thing, or something which is not linear, the effect of not having that additional source of income would be slightly different for the control group as compared to the treatment group, is something that I had in mind.
So yeah, so at baseline, the treatment and control groups did have a similar variation in baseline wealth. I think what this graph seems to suggest is that there are heterogeneous impacts, that they're not necessarily linear based on your wealth, that households that may have had slightly more resources at baseline were able to use those in a different way to have greater impacts in consumption assets. But I hope that answers the question. Let me know if not.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that. Perfect. Well, we're doing great for time. Thanks so much, Christy and Winfred, for your presentation. I'm not seeing any hands up for now, but I know we've got a really rich discussion coming up for the next session, next part of the session. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Tanyah, who's going to lead our discussion. So thank you again to all of our speakers. Yeah, please enjoy the next part of the session.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura. Hi, everyone, and thanks once again for joining us today. And special thanks to Christy and Winfred for such a brilliant presentation just now. My name is Tanyah Hameed, and I'm a Research and Policy Associate here at the Government Outcomes Lab. And it's a true pleasure to be here with you today. I think it's really rare still to see such robust impact evaluations for impact bonds. So it's particularly exciting to both be seeing these encouraging results today, but also to be able to reflect on the program's journey so far. And to help us do that, I'd like to bring in our stellar panel of experts. We are grateful to have with us today many of the key stakeholders who were involved in both developing and implementing the Village Enterprise Development Impact Bond, and who will build on the insights shared in the first part of the session. So together we'll be focusing on three main themes today. Firstly, the role of outcomes-based financing in poverty alleviation and poverty graduation programs. Secondly, of course, we'll be talking about COVID-19, so what the challenges that were presented and how the project adapted to them. And then finally, we'll be also touching on the practical considerations for policymakers and practitioners to keep in mind. And through all of this time, please do keep dropping in any questions or any comments that you have into the chat, and we'll be picking these back up very shortly. But to kick us off, I'd like to come to our panelists one by one. So it would be really fantastic if you could just introduce yourselves very quickly, and in particular perspective that you're bringing today to the discussion. So I'll be coming to you in alphabetical order. Let's start off with Brian, Charlie, and Doug. So over to you first, Brian.
Hey there, thanks. I appreciate that. Brian Boland with the Delta Fund, which is an investment fund that focuses on both philanthropic and investment grants to improve equity around the globe. Our role in this DIB was as the lead investor and anchor investor.
Great. On to Charlie and then Doug.
Hi, everybody. Lovely to meet you. My name is Charlie Morgan. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office at the UK Government. I'm based in London. I currently lead and manage the Development Impact Bonds pilot programme, which was the programme through which we funded the Village Enterprise DIB. And I'm really delighted to be here today to talk about the results. I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of us when I say that there were some very scary moments along the way where we weren't sure if we would be sitting here today with the results to show you, and it's with extreme gratitude to ID Insight, to Village Enterprise and the rest of the working group that we persevered and weathered the storm and are able to come and present all of this to you today. So lovely to be here, and I'm very excited for the discussion.
Thanks, everybody. Great pleasure to have you all here. Thank you so much for attending. Thanks for the panelists and the Go Lab for hosting this. I am Douglas Emyatt. I am a project manager at Instiglio. We are based in Bogota, Colombia, with offices in Nairobi, Kenya, and Rabat, Morocco. Instiglio is a global advisory organization focused on results-based approaches and government effectiveness. So on this project, our role, starting as far back as 2016, was to help source, all the different stakeholders and partners here around the impact bond, drive some of the fundraising from the outcomes funds that came from the outcome payers, leading the technical design of the impact bond and its structure overall, as well as playing the project management role during implementation to help troubleshoot the project implementation, as well as doing an overall learning agenda on this whole experience. So my role was to be the project manager on that, and really excited to touch on some of the lessons learned from this experience and share that all with you, and hope to have a great discussion and hear from all of you in the crowd and any questions and comments you have. So thanks again.
Thanks very much. Next we have Frida, Mara, and Zach.
So thank you very much. My name is Frida Njogundongwe. I am with ID Insight. I am the East and Southern Africa Regional Director. The role that ID Insight played in the DIB was as the evaluator, definitely, as well as we verified the payments, as my colleagues mentioned earlier. Yeah, so thank you very much.
And hi, everybody. I'm Mara Iroldi. I'm the Academic Director at the Government Outcomes Lab. Laura already mentioned what we do at the Government Outcomes Lab. With respect to this project, we were not directly involved. We are really, really interested in the learning that comes from this project. And as part of our mandate, we are here to help the stakeholders involved in the project to share their insight and learning to the wider community. This project was particularly interesting because Village Enterprise has been running similar program without a DIB before the DIB. So there are it's rich in terms of learning material, both for the program itself and also for how it was funded. So really looking forward to this discussion and future discussion on this project.
Hello, everyone. Great to be with you today. My name is Zach Hoynes, and I'm the Chief Operations Officer for Village Enterprise, and was lucky enough to be able to spend the entirety of the Development Impact Bond at VE with the organization in that role, based in Uganda, from design through to the evaluation results that we're having here. So excited to bring the perspective of what the Development Impact Bond and more generally results-based funding had on our operations and our implementation of our program in East Africa.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. It's brilliant to have all of you with us today. So to begin with, I'd like to come to you first, Charlie and Mara. In your experience, what are the sort of rationales and key drivers behind using outcomes-based financing in this particular area, so particularly when it comes to poverty alleviation or poverty graduation programs, such as this project. It would be fantastic to understand this from a government perspective from you, Charlie, and then from a more research and evidence perspective from you, Mara. So over to you first, Charlie.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I'm very happy to share. I think what's maybe helpful is to begin with a bit of context at the time that the Village Enterprise DIB was first sort of set up. And this is back in around 2016, 2017. So at that time, there were very few development impact bonds. I think there had only been 2 so far. And it was still a period of kind of uncertainty really in the sector in terms of whether this tool could be useful, whether it was an effective way of delivering and paying for development interventions. And FCDO, which was DFID at the time, was really interested in this and particularly wanted to build a lot of the evidence around it so that we could see whether this was a tool that would be appropriate for DFID and other funders at the time. So we set up the Development Impact Bonds pilot program in 2017. And particularly, I think the question was, is this a tool that can actually drive the effectiveness and efficiency of international aid? It looked like a viable opportunity for that, but was it actually the case? Would that actually happen? I think there was a lot of expectations around the model that had come out of how it had been trialed in the UK, especially the idea that you can set performance expectations at the very outset of projects. It gives providers more flexibility to achieve their goals. You're incentivizing delivery partners, etc. Able to measure impact. We wanted to know whether this was really the case. So the Development Impact Bonds pilot program was set up to essentially test and trial this across a few different projects, VE being one of them. We also had 2 other projects under the umbrella, which was the ICRC Humanitarian Impact Bond and the Quality Education India Development Impact Bond 2. And I think to talk about the rationales for using it, I mean, we really wanted to learn what the process was of agreeing and managing a development impact bond, whether this would really apply properly in a development context, or was this something that was more suitable sort of to domestic commissioning, for example, whether this would be something that would help us achieve our objectives in our priority areas, which included poverty alleviation at the time, and really to understand the cost and benefits of using the model, to see whether or not, that there are some debates about the cost of an impact bond and whether or not it's more expensive than other types of funding. So we wanted to get to the bottom of some of that. And in terms of the selection of the projects, I already mentioned there were 3 under the umbrella, but particularly VE was a really, really good place to start. Certain conditions do have to be in place, I think, for an impact bond to be viable. And we needed a project that would definitely had a clear aim about why tying payment to outcomes would make sense in this particular context. We wanted one where, the right incentives were there for parties to participate. We wanted a project that kind of had this readiness to shift their mindset towards an outcomes-based approach. And VE obviously had a really good track record as well of having delivered a really effective intervention in the past. They already had an RCT done. So there was a lot of reasons why this made sense to DFID at the time, and that was really, really relevant to our work. So that's some of the key drivers, I suppose, that brought us into this project, this partnership.
Mara, did you want to go next?
Yes, thank you, Tanya. I think when we think about the evidence in this sector, I think there is a lot of evidence on programs for poverty alleviation. There are famous research projects, research finding. Probably everybody is familiar with the work of Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo that emphasize the importance of having these multi-pronged approaches with like grant training, coaching. So there is a lot of research on what could help graduate out of poverty, especially for the ultra poor. But I think with this study, what is interesting is that it adds a dimension, which is the COVID dimension, which is advantageous because it can talk a little bit about the flexibility and was this program able to flex and pivot in response to changing circumstances. It also a limitation, as it was highlighted earlier in the presentation, in terms of can we generalize the finding in a non-COVID context. But I think it's important to distinguish evidence that we have about programs for poverty alleviation and evidence that we have about the governance arrangement. I was mentioning earlier, what I think is particularly interesting in this program is that Village Enterprise has been running similar program before. Like the content, the way they engaged, the way they designed their micro grant was something they did from, I think, 2011. But with this program, they do the same type of intervention, but they change the way in which they organize, they do the monitoring. I know they did a massive investment in a dashboard. So I think this particular program, from an evidence perspective, is really adding to our know-how, because the way they monitor, the way they put the emphasis on the outcome was different. I was revising the early case study and evaluation that the Cohort did for FCDO 2 or 3 years ago, where they did a deep dive on the Village Enterprise. And at the time, it was still quite speculative, and everybody was everybody was emphasizing the focus on outcome, the investment in the M&E, the appetite to be flexible and adaptable. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today and hear from the people who have been on the ground to see where those hope realized. Did you see the flexibility, and can you compare to what you were doing in 2011 to 2016 and what came through? And I'm sure the colleagues from Instiglio, who are in charge for the process evaluation, will tell us more about it in due course. So I think these exercise really adds to our know-how, and I look forward to the stakeholders from the ground.
Thank you so much, both, for setting out some of those key rationales and drivers. Speaking of people on the ground, it'd be fantastic to bring you in, Zach. Of course, you've been really heavily involved with all of the project's design and the delivery. And as Mara mentioned, you've of course been involved in delivering similar programs before the Impact Bond. So I'd be really interested to know your thoughts on what's been your experience of delivering this project as an Impact Bond model. And what were your initial expectations or theory of change around this? And how far do you think these have been realized looking back?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think when we entered this journey, we really, we thought we were a results-based organization, and to an extent we certainly were, but what it's helped us learn is where that really was showing up and where we still have work to do to become focused on our end user, which is our entrepreneur, which is probably the key message I would like to leave with the group today, is that this model, whether it's a DIB or I would anticipate any results-based funding model, really helps align all of the actors towards that end user and that entrepreneur and the success of that individual in a way that I, as an implementer, both at Village Enterprise and other organizations, haven't felt maybe traditional funding models have quite figured out to align those incentives yet. And I think that's why so many of us are interested in this type of model. And we really saw that play itself out. It wasn't just about our activities to our outputs, to our outcomes and our impact. It was about, making sure that line and that theory of change was driving itself all the way to that end. And we really felt that realization. A couple of places that we saw that play out that were different, and I'd say unique to our traditional funding mechanism, was how we approached our adaptive management. And we've alluded to the fact that there was a system created where we were able to create more of a real-time system that allowed us to understand how our entrepreneurs were doing. But it wasn't just the creation of that system. I think a lot of groups do that, right? It was the alignment of the incentives towards the end user that made us ask different questions about that system. I can remember a workshop that we had in Western Kenya. It wasn't just about, what are the indicators of success? I mean, I can't emphasize more. It was really about what are the indicators of success. And we had a lot of debate and a lot of, challenging moments with our mentors and our field associates and our country directors about what indicators were driving success. And it was just a conversation that took on a different flavor than it had in the past. And what it led to, and one of, I think, our most exciting parts of what we've seen in this evaluation was the creation of a stoplight tool that really helped us understand which businesses were struggling, red, and which businesses were doing really well, green. And there were 5 simple indicators that actually we really simplified our approach through the entirety of this, that we were able to see that really did line up when we looked at the impact estimates at the end with businesses that were being more successful. And so that was truly unique in terms of our, implementing this model through the impact bond model. The one other point I'll make that we felt really was different, and this is more from the operational and management standpoint. I think the first example was how our field team felt different about this, was our engagement with stakeholders. Same thing, it was simplified. Now I want to really draw a distinct line here. I know that the creation of the mechanism and all of the work that was pretty complex, and that kind of took its own, we're introducing these for the first time. But when it came to the supervision or accountability of management of the project with stakeholders, there was such a simplified alignment that we haven't found in other traditional programs that allowed us to meet less frequently, but have more impactful meetings with investors, with outcome funders. And, we had some traditional funders, Charlie from FCDO, USAID involved, where we run other projects with those funders side by side. And we're able to feel a real clear difference in the way that all of us interacted in this model versus a traditionally funded model. And so that was another key thing that I think just goes to show that this model has the potential to really focus on that end user and maybe cut out some of the noise so that we can all be more effective in trying to drive the impact that we all hope to see in our missions and our theory of change.
Thank you so much, Zach. Really encouraging to hear about some of those differences, particularly around a better focus on the end user and adaptive management. Thanks very much for highlighting that. And so coming to you next, Brian, as one of the investors on this project, it would be fantastic to tease out the role of social investment a bit more. So what do you think are some of the opportunities that social investment and cross-sector collaborations can bring to projects such as these, focusing on poverty alleviation or poverty graduation?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a really interesting question when you think about how to invest in scale in these kinds of programs. If you kind of up level what we've learned from this study, there's a couple things that we know. One, we have yet again more evidence that graduation programs work, right? Like I think as a corpus of knowledge, we should feel really confident in graduation programs. And I think specifically we have really strong information around Village Enterprise and their ability specifically to very effectively execute a graduation program that outperformed our initial expectations. So I think that's one kind of just like corpus baseline set of knowledge. But when you look at any of these kinds of programs and initiatives, you start to work on them, you get some results in, as has been mentioned, Village Enterprise did their own RCT, which gave certainty that their model worked. But then you have questions around scale. Can this program grow? Can it scale, et cetera? And I think that's where, for us, the role of this development impact bond came in. If we knew that the organization could do a good job, how do you attract extra capital to come in and say that we can help this organization grow? And you reduce the risk for organizations like FCDO and USAID on investing ahead of time in only paying for results that they know actually worked and scaled. And so that was one of the really exciting things for us. And frankly, exciting to see organizations like FCDO innovate, right? You don't necessarily think of governments innovating. This is really an innovative project that they did. And so that's kind of an exciting advent. But let's talk about capital. If you look at the world of philanthropic money, there's over $1 trillion. And that I didn't misspeak, $1 trillion tied up in foundations. If you look in the United States, the largest charity is Fidelity Charitable. They have $30 billion in assets under management. A lot of that is invested in the stock market. I love Coca-Cola, but I don't think investing in Coca-Cola, the company, is saving the world, right? So if we can start to attract more of these sideline capital dollars into helping these organizations and these projects scale, it's really a huge opportunity for us to affect really good change in the world while if these programs are successful, protecting that capital because we can have those grants returned. Huge opportunity for growth, huge opportunity for the organizations that should absolutely scale like Village Enterprise to start to have these models that can bring this capital that frankly is on the sidelines, even though societally we've given the benefits of tax breaks and tax cuts to folks who invest in these or who give their money to these foundations. It should be put to work. And I think now we have models like this that we can start to put things to work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brian. Just before we move on to the next part of discussion, I just want to turn to the chat and take a couple of questions from there. So I see that we have a couple of questions from Rien, I believe. Sorry, I must be mispronouncing your name, but if you wanted to unmute yourself and perhaps ask your question, or you have a question for Charlie and also for Zach. So please feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tanya. Hi, everybody. My name is Rien Hazelegen. Don't worry about my name, Tanya. Everybody is mispronouncing that. I have a question for Charlie, and I really like your introduction where you said there could have been a moment that we wouldn't have been here. You were talking also about the interest of DFID and FCDO in development impact bonds, but you were talking in past tense. So, and I think the big question that was lingering when you stopped talking is, so do DIBs make sense? So, and that's really my key question for you. The question that I have for Zach is, knowing that you had these interventions before and you embarked on a real journey with DIBs, would you use a DIB again? Or will you be using the lessons learned from this DIB in, let's say, your traditional method? So basically improving what you did in the past, but leave the instrument as such.
Thank you. Great questions there. So Charlie, did you want to go first and then I can bring you in, Zach?
Absolutely, yes. And thank you so much for your question. It's a very good one. I like how you said that it was lingering there. I'm very happy to satisfy that. I think we've learned an enormous amount through this program. And I mean, in short, this has been a fantastic and very positive experience for us as a funder. It's not just met, but exceeded many of our expectations in terms of what we were looking for from the program, but also what we were looking for from the DIB structure and mechanism as a whole. I think echoing what Brian and what Zach have already said, it's really demonstrated and provided so much more evidence on how these mechanisms can work, on whether, like, on the fact that we can now, you know, define outcomes in poverty alleviation which work for everybody. The fact that we can design and enact these successful measurements and evaluations that then enable payment. The fact that the service provider did in fact have more flexibility to do their intervention, and that's been really transformative for their operations. And the fact that to some extent, perhaps not completely, but to some extent, risk was effectively transferred from the outcome funders to the investors. I say to some extent because due to the very unprecedented nature of the pandemic, we did enter into discussions and negotiations to redistribute some of that risk, but that was very much part of our partnership working, and definitely not what we would think of as a failure of the risk transfer mechanism in any way. So in terms of the program and what we've learned through it, absolutely so much. There is, however, something that we still don't know, which is that these results in this evaluation speak very much to the effectiveness and the quality of the intervention in the program that Village Enterprise ran. It doesn't necessarily show us conclusively that the DIB was instrumental in that. We believe, I think many of the stakeholders involved in the project believe that, but we still need more robust evidence around that to really say that conclusively. And we are running a program level evaluation over the whole of the DIBS pilot program at FCDO that should hopefully help us answer that question. We'll be using data from Village Enterprises grant funded programs versus the DIB funded programming to see if we can draw out some of the distinctions. But there's also been a process review being run by Instiglio, so perhaps Doug will speak more to that separately a bit later, to look into what impact or what effect actually did using a DIB have on the effectiveness and the efficiency of this program. So just as a bit of a caveat there to say we're really happy with it, but obviously it hasn't answered every question that we had at the outset of our pilot.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Zach, can I bring you in next?
Yeah, to speak specifically to the development impact bond mechanism, I think there's individuals that are better placed to answer the question as a whole of whether the right results-based funding mechanism, what works for what group. But when it comes to results-based funding, I can answer categorically yes, Rin, that not only with my experience at Village Enterprise, but past experiences and reflection, I think that's going to be a transformational piece of where we're moving to be able to keep the entrepreneurs and our end users at the center of our work. Pretty categorical answer there. It's a yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for your question. I'd like to move us on to the next part of the discussion, where we'll be talking a bit more about COVID-19. So we're going to talk a bit more about the challenges, but also the adaptation that the project has shown in response to the pandemic. So if I could come to you first, Doug, you have obviously been very much at the center of this project and have had oversight of all its various elements. So could you perhaps describe some of the challenges faced due to the pandemic and how the project adapted to these? And did you see any aspects of the impact bond that you felt like fed into this adaptation and potentially helped with it?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tanya. Certainly, I'm sure everybody in the room can relate to the challenges faced during the past 2 coming on 3 years of the pandemic, not only in your own professional projects, et cetera, but just personally. So we felt many of these pains throughout the project. So I would just highlight 3 kind of broad categories. The Village Enterprise project implementation. Certainly, their job is working with participants, entrepreneurs in the field, doing business savings groups, mentorship, training, and this is interrupted quite simply by lockdowns and the inability of people to meet face to face at the very start of the pandemic, and while the project was ongoing. So that was a big challenge that Village Enterprise had to face and be creative and think, how do we adapt to the situation of not being able to do trainings in person with people, which is a core part of their program. The second one, just around the governance structure and the DIB contracting that brought all of these parties together was challenged. And I would just highlight one key piece there of a standard force majeure in the outcomes payment agreement, force majeure clause saying, if Village Enterprise cannot do their program due to flood, acts of God, et cetera, what happens to the project then? And we had to have many discussions to decide kind of on the one end of the spectrum, do we keep the program intact and keep it moving forward despite these challenges? On the opposite end of the spectrum, should we just completely shut the project down? Or is there something in between these 2 options where we can move forward? And third, I think it's easy from our seat sometimes to think about the program that we're designing and that we're implementing, but I want to keep a human-centered focus on why we do these projects, and that's the entrepreneurs in the field, right? And just recognizing the challenges that they faced. These are some of the most vulnerable, most poor populations, and likely the most heavy hit and first to feel the impacts of the COVID challenge, whether that be through their communities and jobs and businesses being hit, health impacts certainly from the pandemic. So all of these 3 challenges create, quite a storm that we had to go through. So I would just highlight, how did we adapt to these challenges? What specifically about the instruments were helpful in helping us get through that? I would just highlight this structure around the impact bond was really instrumental in giving Village Enterprise the flexibility to adapt their program. As mentioned, cohorts 5, 6, and 7 happened post-pandemic, and that's one example, I think, which is really interesting, where Village Enterprise could provide additional mentorship, adjust to the situation and say, these people are going through a lot of unplanned circumstances with the pandemic. How can we provide additional services and mentorship? And that was something that did not have to go through layers of approval, which you might see in an otherwise kind of activity-driven program or contract. But instead, Village Enterprise was able to make whatever shifts they needed to do in pursuit of the final result. And this did not have to be approved by the group. And I think that was one just kind of exciting example of that. The impact bond really was a pilot that was launching this outcomes fund structure where we're pooling together multiple outcome payers under one outcomes payment agreement, making the commitments to a trustee. All to say this structure was really helpful in giving the overall governance structure flexibility to say, instead of having multiple different contracts for all the different outcome payers, this would have been otherwise, I think, a really challenging situation to say, we're going to adapt the program and have some flexibility here, but each of your individual contracts will have to be changed. No, instead, what we had was a collective group working under this structure that had the flexibility to come to negotiations and agreements to more easily, in terms of administrative cost and effort, keep the program moving forward. And quite frankly, I think this was one of the few outcomes-based types of designs that stayed intact during the pandemic. Many other programs did move to, just paying for activities or finding other ways to relieve the situation by moving away from outcomes-based payments. So that was really exciting that we're able to stay intact with that. And the last point I would say, of kind of on the special sauce and softer side of things, with all of these, with the impact bond structure and governance structure that had us together, was this group was really committed to the final success of the project. And I say special sauce because it's kind of just the stakeholder management and bond that this group shared, where you have a lot of forward-thinking, innovative and dedicated champions who are interested to see this project through. And not only providing the means and flexibility for Village Enterprise, but keeping that focus on what's going to be best for the entrepreneurs in the field and how are we going to help improve their livelihoods by keeping this program intact. So not following necessarily the black and white letter of the contract to say, sure, we could shut this project down, but let's come together, let's come up with creative solutions to keep this project moving forward. And I think that was something really special among this group, with everybody here at the table and everybody else behind the scenes, to keep this project moving. I think was really something special that this impact bond, I think, helped create that through the structure and the partnerships that we all created.
Thank you so much, Doug. Great to hear that some of that flexibility and shared sense of success were able to help with the adaptation. And to zoom in on the service delivery aspect of things a bit more, could I bring you back in, Zach? So how did Village Enterprise adapt to COVID-19 and help mitigate some of these challenges for the treatment groups? This also potentially feeds into a question in the chat from Quentin, who's asked about potential differences to the level of community engagement that you might have seen. In addition to that, do you anticipate any sort of long-term effects on Village Enterprise as an organization, but also on any related projects as a result of this dip?
Great, yeah, and to answer the COVID piece, I think going back to the urgency that the results-based funding structure gave to our organization was set in place, but obviously before the pandemic came there. And with that urgency came some benefits, flexibility, and being able to think about how we're going to get to that impact, a focus on efficiency and effectiveness when it came to deploying the program. And as part of that, we saw our digital journey really start to take off before the pandemic. Mentioned the adaptive management system, how that tool was a digital tool that a mentor could access from their work sites far away from any Village Enterprise office. We also really stressed ourselves on digital cash transfers, which not only helped more effectively distribute capital to our entrepreneurs through our grant transfer, but it also, helped some of our entrepreneurs pick up the phone and really use that in a way that's been proven to have a big impact. And so you see where I'm going with this is COVID hits, that foundation allowed us to be able to really transition to address the challenges that came. We talk about community engagement. Yeah, certainly East Africa had some some legitimate lockdowns for extended amounts of time, where that digital journey that we were able to kind of have before that allowed us to re-engage through the phone. Another key factor, our business mentors are hired from the communities from where they come from. And so that was something that really served to our advantage during these lockdowns. So that digital journey really did help us adapt to the lockdown. And then I'm sure, as most of you experienced, it just went on overdrive after pandemic. It really became a central focus. And so now you get to this question of, how does this impact bond affect us in the future? And you got to tie those things together with COVID as well, because it was such a huge part of this project. Is we're not in these, I'll just say, these weird debates about whether or not someone should be in an office or where they should be at. Like, this has helped us continue to align about how does our staffing structure, does our deployment of the program, does our office structure support that entrepreneur at the end? And that thinking that has been there helped us through the DIB, helped us through COVID, and I think will be a lasting effect for years to come. And again, it has allowed us to eliminate some of this noise, and there's a lot of noise in international development, to be able to stay focused on that end game. The last point I'll make on this is we had 3 primary innovations: the adaptive management system, the digital cash transfers, and we did some work around our digital training. And all of those have already been deployed to the furthest parts of our organization. There's a few that, with the digital training was the last innovation that's almost there, but we don't see that happen with all of our innovations on a specific project, to be able to see that. And I'm going to tie that back to the intent of results-based funding was to guarantee an outcome that justified the investment in a program. And so obviously, when you create investments with that in mind, you're going to want to take those investments, and they just naturally rolled into the rest of our program. And so that's going to be another long-term effect on groups that aren't even under a results-based funding structure in our organization.
Thank you so much, Zach. That's super helpful. And of course, COVID has also impacted how the program is being evaluated and the RCD itself, which is something that Christy touched upon earlier in the presentation. So Frida, given your involvement with the research, I'd love to bring you in next. Could you perhaps tell us a bit more about how COVID and lockdowns influence data collection and project results for the evaluation and the RCT?
Yeah, thank you very much. So first of all, I really want to congratulate Village Enterprises on their successful implementation during the pandemic. I think this was a really challenging time for anyone, and also just a working group. I want to thank the working group for their flexibility through the tough times. So I think I'll just talk about a bit about how it impacted our data collection and about how it impacted our results. So one was delays and interruptions, which increase our costs, as was mentioned earlier by my colleague. Especially for the first 4 cohorts, we had to collect their data more than a year later than planned. So again, field logistics, this was our first in-person data collection exercise during, or at least after COVID started. So, there was, differences in logistics, cost, isolation, et cetera, et cetera. So really just the whole management of the data collection exercise was impacted. And we shared a link to a blog article that was written about how we did this. So I'd be happy for all of us to have a look at that if you're interested. Then as far as the results are concerned, maybe let me first go back one more about the data collection timeline. As I mentioned, so this meant that we had to collect for some of the cohorts much later. And so this could have actually had, allowed us to assess like the sustainability of the program. So this was a very interesting angle, especially for the first cohort. You could see the impact beyond the expected time. Again, in terms of the questionnaire, because of COVID, we had to shorten the duration of the questionnaire. So from two to 1 hour. So this again meant, revising some of the tools, and based on older data, existing data and available surveys, and just really using some multipliers. So I think there was some interesting modifications there. Then in terms of the results, I think one of the ones that is really interesting is, we think that COVID may have affected the results in ways that we may not see using the data. So for instance, maybe the program might have been, the effect might have been higher, but because of, could have been higher, but because of the shocks, because of COVID, then COVID may have actually blunted the effect among the treatment group. But then again, also, if the treatment groups were more resilient, for instance, they were able to, if the program made the treatment groups more resilient to the economic impacts of the pandemic, then again, you'll end up seeing a greater effect. We did some additional analysis on how households felt that they were affected by COVID. And about 87% of households mentioned that they were negatively impacted by COVID. But what is interesting was that when we compared the households that reported being negatively impacted versus those that did not, there were really no differences in program effects. So that's an interesting finding for us. I think another thing that was different was, a slight change in the payment formula. We had a outcomes payment formula initially that was, to be calculated for the 2 rounds of data collection. So when we combine the two rounds, we actually end up with a more simplified payment formula. So, however, I mean, at the end of the day, really, the impact in terms of the amount of money paid out, there was no difference, because with both calculations, VE would still have maxed out their deep payment due to the size of the effects that the program had. So I think those are some of the things that we found during that were impacted by COVID. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frida. Very helpful. Before we move on to the last part of the discussion, I wanted to bring in Rogers, who had a really interesting question in the chat around the role of government. So did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. And thank you for the presentation and for the panelists. So I'll just read out my question. It's basically, what role or roles did, if any, did the local and the national governments play in the success of the DIB? And going forward, what do you envision their key roles will be? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any particular people want to go and answer that question?
I'd love to jump in. This is something actually coming to some of the closing points. I was going to touch on this, so thank you very much, Roger's very timely question. Big picture, I mean, maybe Zach and the Village Enterprise team can talk about local engagements that they have, but I think this is really important for the future call to action on this project and the learnings that we've had. I think it's really important and exciting that we take this moment to reflect on this specific experience and what did we learn, and the great positive impact that this project has had. But what does this mean for the next step? What does this mean for the future? And Stiglia, we're very invested and interested in how do we take this to a larger scale? And that typically does involve getting governments integrated into this kind of thinking, and how can we take this experiment and integrate it potentially into government systems so that their design of social programs and implementation of social programs are as impactful as possible, reach the most people as possible, are as cost effective as possible, have the greatest evidence of the results that they're achieving as possible. And who better to do that than through governments. And actually talking with Charlie and other partners of FCDO, we've been exploring how to take this experiment as potentially initially designed as a pilot to give us this learning, to then scale it up into a larger poverty alleviation outcomes fund. And for years, we actually engaged with government officials in Kenya and Rwanda, exploring their interest in how they could use this type of instrument to inform their social programming. And we have gotten a lot of positive reception of this idea. Of course, a government systems change is not something that happens from today to tomorrow, but is a long-term process and engagement with them to try to integrate this evidence-based, results-based thinking into their future planning. So I would kind of also turn it back on everybody here in the room to say, what can we do collectively to make this not just a one-shot game where we learn some interesting things and we pat ourselves on the back about, but how do we take it to the next level with governments and others, with Delta Fund and on the investor side, as well as the foundations, the untapped potential of private foundations and charities getting into the game. And I think the best approach is to come to the governments and say, what are the challenges you have and how can we help you, government, overcome that barrier and bring a results-based financing instrument and tool to help you understand the impact you need to achieve. How do we measure that and how do we get there? So I think it's a really important call to arms for all of us in the room to say, how can we take this to the next level?
Thank you so much, Rogers, and thank you, Doug. And I see that, Zach, you put in your response into the chat. Thanks very much for that as well. I know we have about 15 minutes left, so I'd love to move us on to the last part of the discussion, this was a great segue into, which is around the practical considerations for policymakers and practitioners going forward. And so for this, I'd love to come to you, Charlie, Brian, and Doug. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in particular on any implications that this DIB project and also this evaluation report will have, particularly for any future poverty graduation programs or future DIBs? And also, are there any particular practical considerations or advice that you want to highlight to someone who wants to develop an impact bond in this space in the future? So shall we start with Charlie, then Brian, and then Doug? Just some quick thoughts from everyone. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Absolutely. I mean, I think so much of the conversation has been around how effective this program is. And how well executed it was as well. So I think the implication of that, at least from a funder's perspective, is that this is a very good investment, and anyone looking to develop programs in poverty graduation or cash transfer programs, for example, should definitely be looking to this program for inspiration on how to do it well. I think from a funding perspective as well, the implications that for funders are that this model definitely gives funders more control over what they're paying for without being overly involved in how it's achieved. And I think, and placing, the power of the decision making really in the hands of those closest to the program and closest to those actually benefiting from the services being delivered. And that in itself, I think, has big implications, because that's not how most programming in poverty graduation programming currently works or is currently funded. At least from the conversations I've had, it's often quite sort of inputs-based, grant-funded programs where there's limited control, both in terms of the activities, from a funder's perspective, I mean, and on the outcomes or the impacts achieved. So I think the implications of this project are quite significant for funders of those types of projects. And I think another implication that occurred to me was that using this type of approach, an outcomes approach, may provide a higher level of security of funding in the long term, because we saw, as a result of the recession caused by the pandemic, a large number of programs, especially bilaterally grant-funded programs, being closed down as a result of budget cuts and a constrained funding environment. And I think it's quite powerful that this program succeeded, I think in part because of the very long-term commitment that outcome funders and everybody had made to the project. And I would say that there are certainly clear advantages to having that long-term commitment, especially in these kind of constrained funding environments. So I think there's a great deal of implications for funders that come out of this project. Pressing on to practical advice and tips, I think for me there's sort of three that we've learned so much, it's really hard to synthesize. So it was very difficult for me to choose three things to focus on. But the first one I'd say is the need to scale. So for anyone looking to develop an impact bond, think about whether it's an impact bond that you want to develop or something a bit bigger. We've done an amazing job, I think, with this first one. Village Enterprise has performed fantastically. But I would say single deals like this one, even though they are great as a demonstration effect, to really achieve impact on a much bigger scale, you do need to start looking at scaling the intervention, whether that's scaling across more interventions, so commissioning multiple interventions at once under the same fund, whether that's scaling into bigger, further geographies, whether that's involving more donors and pooling more funding. I think we should be looking to build on this example, not just replicate it. And outcome funds are one way of doing that. We're trialing using outcome funds in education currently in Ghana and Sierra Leone, where we'll be co-commissioning education outcomes in those two countries with other donors at a much bigger scale than has been tried previously. So we're going to be exploring and building more evidence on how well this works. But for us, definitely practical advice is think bigger. A second piece of practical advice is be realistic about expectations around risk transfer, especially this is, I think, a note for funders in particular. A DIB is often touted as this powerful tool for, risk transfer to an investor. And I feel like that is definitely the case in some ways, but it's not necessarily helpful to think about it as an entire transfer of risk and more of a redistribution of risk and more of a partnership that's being built between different stakeholders across different sectors. And I think that's very important to note, because when you think about it that way and you think about it as a partnership or about redistributing risk and being flexible and being responsive to that, it's definitely a much more powerful and a much more positive partnership that you can build. And finally, I think, speaking to Roger's point, the third sort of piece of practical advice that I'd have is around sustainability. So ensuring that beyond just building your impact bond, to what extent will this be carried on? To what extent will this approach be mainstreamed? To what extent are you developing capacity in others to continue to fund on outcomes and on impact? You might not always need a development impact bond to do this. You might not always need necessarily external investment to do this, but shifting to an outcomes-based approach or an outcomes mindset is really beneficial for everybody involved, and especially the end users of these services, because everybody is working hard and converging to make sure that their needs are really met in a meaningful and sustainable way. And to really reap the benefits of the model, that does need to be baked into more normal ways of funding. This shouldn't just be a one-off project. This needs to be something that's done more sustainably, more long-term. And in order to do that, as Doug already said, you need to start involving governments to be doing this themselves. If someone mentioned in the chat, why do we think that they're not already doing that? Some governments definitely are. Others haven't yet started exploring that. So maybe encouraging them to do so, demonstrating these cases, these examples, and showing how it can be done. I think that's going to be really, really important going forward. So always think about sustainability. And at least in the education outcomes funds that we're doing, that was an essential part of our scaling up approach. We are co-commissioning those two outcome funds with the domestic governments of Ghana and Sierra Leone, specifically to help build capacity in those governments and help make sure that they can continue to commission in this way going forward. So those are sort of my 3 bits of advice. I'm sorry I took too much time, but I already told you it was too hard to narrow it down, so I'll pass it over.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I'll pass it on to Brian and then Doug.
Great. Yeah, I'll try to be quick. So I think one is a real commitment towards some sense of results-based funding. I think there's a couple things to think about here. One, development impact bonds take time. They're pretty big and they're a heavy lift, and they're a tax on the organization and everyone involved. So I see them as a really important calibration point, that you should do them at points in time, right? So if you're about to scale, you're trying to scale, or you're scaling significantly, and then there are a number of things you can measure as an organization along the way that correlate highly to the causal outcomes. So these outputs that are indicative of the outcomes can be measured along the way, and we can start to fund organizations around those. And I'm very interested in exploring that with Village Enterprise and others. So I think DIBs are incredible. Any funder, any donor should have confidence at this point that Village Enterprise works. Like this is like rigorous beyond rigorous, but that shouldn't be how every funding is done. The second practical thing I'd think about in creating a DIB is a really clear construction of the working group. Who is involved in the working group? Who has which decision-making roles in the working group? You want to have it representative, but not too big. I think that's something to wrestle through as people build these in the future. And then, contracts are constructed with the theory of a plan B, what happens when things go wrong, but nobody thinks that things go wrong. But if you think about the places where we're working around the world, there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. So I think really developing a set of rigor and expertise around the plan B is really important moving forward.
Thank you so much, Brian. And then finally on to you, Doug.
Yeah, I would just highlight, I think it's great to take stock of some of these great learnings that will certainly come out in, as others have mentioned, this process review that Insiglia is doing, and on the bigger picture of what we learned in this process of how this instrument can be effective and efficient in the future. But I echo the sentiments of Brian and Charlie on the importance of scaling and other lessons learned. But I would just highlight the results are impressive here. It's really exciting just to see during the pandemic that there are positive results, and compared to other graduation programs of similar or even larger impact, really important to just inform the larger ecosystem of these programs and the success. Second, just this is an important data point that we see for the impact bonds in our ecosystem and growing that knowledge from years ago, just a couple impact bonds to now where we are today and how these instruments can be impactful. As Charlie mentioned, FCDO is doing a wider study of all the impact bonds that they're engaged in and feeding those lessons learned to the ecosystem so people have this knowledge and it's out there, and I encourage you all to seek it. But this knowledge has taken us one step forward to see just how effective these instruments are, and touching on that, just saying this experience of testing this first pilot of a potential outcomes fund where we're pooling together different funders under one contract, using a trustee to hold those funds, et cetera. This was overall very positive and successful. I think it taught us that we can bring together multiple outcome funders, including people like USAID and FCDO, large agencies in the aid world. It proved that we can use an independent trustee to hold these funds, hold the contracts, make this work. It proved that, yes, Village Enterprise, through the process review, we learned that Village Enterprise did have a strong focus on the end results. They did have flexibility we were able to test all these different things. So I think all of these things are really positive takeaways. And so again, this call to arms and this call to action of what can we do? What is stopping us now from using all this positive, successful lessons learned from this intervention and from this experience? What's stopping us from taking it to the next level and scaling? So echo those sentiments of how important it is to get governments even more involved in thinking this way to scale this to the next level.
Thank you so much. Some brilliant points from all three of you there around scaling, sustainability, risk redistribution, decision-making structures, and of course, expanding knowledge within our ecosystem. So thanks very much for those really helpful points. Finally, I'd love to come back to you, Frida. So from a research and learning perspective, what's been your experience of using the RCT in this evaluation? And are there any sort of trade-offs that you wanted to highlight? And also going forward, what do you think should be the focus for future research or learning in this space?
Thank you very much. I'll try to keep it very short. I think for us, we are really happy that for this particular DIB, it was an RCT. I think to the extent that you're working in vulnerable communities, an RCT or other rigorous methodology will give you more confidence that you're actually measuring program impact, separate from whatever else will go on. And especially when there are shocks, such as, with COVID. So I think in this case, we are really happy because we're able to still learn something useful despite the big disruption. Otherwise, we would not, probably the DIB would have, I don't know that we could have actually been able to say what the effect, what the program effects were if we did not have an RCT, because then we're able to have, two communities that have experienced similar, two groups that have experienced similar impacts, whether health or economic, and then we're able to actually measure what their, the impacts of this were on the program effects that were the relevant program effects. So I think because we had randomized exactly similar groups, this was made possible. I think the other thing that, the other thing that reason we are really happy that we did an RCT for this was that already we had results of an RCT previously in Uganda, and really our evaluation also found similar effect sizes in Uganda. However, if we had not done an RCT and we're generalizing the findings, trying to apply them to Kenya, we would have actually missed the significantly greater impact in Kenya. where it was fourfold impact. So we'd have really underestimated the impact of VE's work more broadly. So I think that's one, but I think broadly speaking about whether, I think one of the things we want to discuss is whether, RCTs are always required for this kind of evaluation. I think impact evaluations using experimental or quasi-experimental methods are needed if the endpoint that the payers are trying to, incentivize is a change in fundamental development outcomes. If you're talking about, graduation rates, health status, family income, et cetera, et cetera. So the only way we can actually know whether the program being implemented caused the desired outcome relative to what happened in say a control setting. However, if the endpoint that the payers are seeking to incentivize is more like an output, for example, how many of in a particular community received a particular intervention, or how many more schools were reached. In that case, we are looking to incentivize an output, then impact evaluations are not necessary. So in these cases, external validation can be done, for instance, using administrative data or surveys of, just the participants alone. So you don't need anything beyond that. You don't necessarily need a very strong comparison group. And for poverty graduation programs, you could have, so both types of endpoints might be of interest to payers, so then you will determine, what to do. So if an organization has already gone through a rigorous RCT in the past, and you were able to determine, what the mediators of impact were, then subsequently you may only just need to measure those mediators. So for instance, specific inputs. I think I also just want to say that maybe just one more point about this is that the kind of evaluation you have is extremely important, because an experimental or quasi-experimental method ensures that you have greater confidence, so you don't end up either overestimating the impact, which then becomes a risk for the payers, or underestimating impact, which becomes a risk for investors. So this is extremely important. As far as what we think is transferable to other contexts, I'd be hesitant to say that findings can be transferred, because of context varies significantly. So we'd be wary. For instance, I talked about previous estimates in Uganda versus what we found in Kenya. That then would have underestimated the impact of VE's work there in a different setting. So I think I would, again, COVID, we may not be able to apply this everywhere because of the impact of COVID. What could be transferred, I think, would be things like some of the methods or some of the procedures. For instance, we talked about what we did in shortening the questionnaire. So this would be a good option for where you need to measure consumption more rapidly. So for instance, where cost or time is critical. And also some of the other things like the protocols that we develop for in-person data collection during COVID. I think these are some of the things that can be shared more broadly. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Frida. And thank you everyone for those really rich reflections and such a great discussion. It's been so great to hear from all of the different stakeholder perspectives and different roles, and to see them all sort of come together to understand this journey that you've been on together to develop the project, implement it, and then finally, of course, learn from it. And so for the final part of the session, I'd love to come to you, Mara, to sum up some of the main conclusions that we've had today. I know it's never an easy task, but you always do a great job. So over to you, and then we'll close the session after that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tanyah. This has been a very rich session. The only thing I would like to highlight is some of my notes from the conversation we had today. This is a success story. It's really refreshing to hear a success story. It's also a high toll because there is a question of what next. But in terms of the success, my main takeaway is that the stakeholder highlighted how having an outcome focus, in this case it was a DIB, but other outcome-based approaches seems to really, I wrote down, create user-centeredness on steroids. So Zach really resonated with me, like Village Enterprise clearly is an organization. There is some sort of maybe entry like self-selection. Organization who wants to work with an outcome focus tend to be outcome driven, but it seems that working in an outcome-based approach contractually opened the gate to do it to the nth degree. And I thought this was interesting. and a useful lesson to take away. Nice to see confirmed that there was this flexibility and the agility to do the change without going through a lot of red tape because, oh, we are changing the activity. But the question that Roger asked about what's next, will you do a deep next time? I think this is the big question now. We have a success story. Was this a pilot? Do we want to take the learning to doing business with a result-based financing without an impact investor? What is the appetite of organizations like Delta to put at risk their capital? I thought for Village Enterprise, the appetite is to stick to an outcome-based approach of some shape or form because it allowed this focus. But how do we achieve scale? I think is the next question that we need to turn to now after we've done this exercise. So I just want to thank you, everybody, and I'll pass it over to Tanyah for closing remarks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mara, for those final thoughts, and a big thank you to both our speakers and our audience for joining us today. This is unfortunately my last Engaging with Evidence session, as I'm sadly moving on from this role soon, but it's been fantastic to see so many familiar faces joining us regularly since we first started off in January 2021. And thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience. It's been fantastic to engage with evidence together. The series will of course continue, and my colleagues will be back on the 6th of April with another Engaging with Evidence session, this time focusing on country and ecosystem readiness for outcomes-based partnerships. We'll be sharing much more about this event in the coming days, so please do watch this space. There's a link to our newsletter, sign up in the chat, so please do sign up to that. And in the meantime, take care and have a great rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.